I'd love to tell you that this was a play that I'd always wanted to do and stuff like that. I knew Strindberg. I went to college and, we studied Miss Julie and Dream Play and Ghost Sonata and all that kind of stuff. But I didn't know this. I did know The Stronger. And we had already settled on The Stronger, which would feature 2 female actors. And so I was like, well, what could we pair with that? And it wasn't necessarily going to be Strindberg initially. So we were looking around for different stuff. And then my partner, Melissa Nicholson, who's my wife, also the executive director, said, do you know this play? And I said, no, I don't know it. And she's like, well, give it a read. It's 2 male actors, and that's what I needed. I needed a play for 2 male actors. And so I said, well, I'll give it a read. And I hate to tell you this, I was mildly intrigued. I thought, well, this is interesting. It's about one guy who I think is just a horrible guy and another guy that I'm not too sure about yet. But let me check it out. And so I read it and I gave it a deeper read, and I thought, well, I think I'm getting some deeper stuff here I didn't know. This was one of those that in rehearsal, we just kept finding things, and I was like, I don't know if Strindberg put all this in. I'd like to think that he did. I mean, I think he writes a pretty good play. It's from a different time period, but I think he writes a pretty good play. And so I started finding these things, and I'm like, well, this guy says this, but later on he contradicts himself. Does he do that on purpose? And this guy says he did this, but we find out later in the way he's talking, he might not have done that. And I've always been fascinated by unreliable narrator stories. So you get a really good story, but you're like, I don't know if that was the truth or not. I wanted to set it during the period as much as I could, and really look into and just through rehearsals keep saying, all right, what's coming out of this? And these rehearsals were actually very different than a lot that I do. There wasn't a lot of blocking, like, well, you will cross to the down left part of the stage. At this point, you will stand here. And there was none of that. There was a lot of, let's try this again. Let's try this way. Will this line make sense if we go that way? So concept, I mean, it's period. It's late 1800s and European. But I think it's a fascinating play now. I'm so glad we're doing it.
Because the piece on paper is so philosophical. It seems like just this sort of very heady kind of debate that sometimes feels like it's just semantics, because there's so little outside of this 45-minute conversation. There's, you get the tidbits of each character's past, but both are kind of unreliable as far as whether they're telling the truth or not. I do love plays like this because they are just such a snapshot. They're most people's lives aren't filled with drama or like the height of emotions that most plays take part in. That's the stuff we want to watch. We want to watch the highs and the lows. And so I always feel like this kind of script feels very real because these things happen in such a short amount of time. I think The Outcast is so much subtext, so much subtext that rarely is what we're saying what we mean. So having, really trying to create emotions behind the belief. Why is it this? Why must it be this? Why must I convince myself that that's truth? And also my scene partner.
Race and the ideology of it and the scientific backing of it is discussed within this play. And to the extent that I think that the way that we know race and its terminology today is very different than whatever the context may have been for it back in the 18th and 17th century, when the word was actually starting to develop. And so it was interesting reading this play as lineal, a black man and going through the script and just trying to interpret the script for what it was when it was written at that time, which would have been a completely different play. Also, when you look at the script, you initially know that the two actors in the play are most likely white or European men. And so I knew from starting this that it would take on a different interpretation, not necessarily knowing if it was going to be the playwright's interpretation or his intention of the play, but because my body had to occupy this role, I knew for a fact that the meaning of this story was going to shift, that things were going to become very apparent in the sense that you realize as you're watching this play, this conversation that is happening, that's taking place in this period in the middle, late 1800s, is still the conversation that we're having today. As you go through the script, Strindberg doesn't really give you a lot of backstory of who your character is or what their motivations are or any of that. And within the 45 minutes of this play that we go through, there is so much that happens, but there is so little backstory that explains why these characters end up in the situations that they do. And I'm not sure if, Strindberg's intention was to not give backstory and narratives of, truth for these characters, because maybe that's the point, by leaving that undocumented, so that when you step into this role, or if anyone is watching this, you can just relate based on this short amount of time that you see these two humans interacting and having a conversation with each other.
Because there are subjects, there are topics in the Outcast that are immediately relevant, and those things have been shifting over the past 3 months. The year, the decade, but it's amazing to see between terminology and mindset culturally for some of these things, that it would be a different play if we had done it in January.
If it's timeless in any way, it's because it's an ethical detective story, and I think anybody who lives an examined life is in the midst of an ethical detective story.